Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I sure hope you'll still be applauding after the budget. It's all because of Travis Taze. Thank you so much, Barry, to you and all of the leadership team of AUMA for the warm invitation, the great welcome, but more importantly, for the work that you and all of our councillors and mayors do across this province to build communities and to work for a more prosperous Alberta. I am so honored to be here with over half of Alberta's cabinet and many members of the government caucus to reinforce the seriousness of our new government's devotion to a partnership of respect with our municipalities. Now, they've given me a 32-page speech to read here that I'm going to ignore. All right. It always gets my staff nervous. What could possibly go wrong? But I want to speak to you from the heart about issues that are of vital importance to our citizens, to your residents, to all Albertans. But let me begin by saying how honored our team is to have received the largest democratic mandate in Alberta history, a mandate to get our provincial economy back on track, to stand up and fight for a fair deal for Alberta in the Canadian Federation. And we cannot do that without being Team Alberta, and that includes all of us from different political persuasions from every region of the province, from diverse backgrounds, from communities large and small, from Edmonton and Calgary to the summer villages and to the rural municipalities, our mid-sized cities and in between. We all need to be rowing in the same direction towards prosperity and a strong future for Alberta. I want to, please. And I want to talk to you about three key areas where we need to work together in partnership to collaborate in the service of our citizens. First of all, about getting our economy back on track. Secondly, about getting Alberta's finances in order. And thirdly, about standing up for Alberta and getting a fair deal in the Canadian Federation. On the first question, it is no secret that we have gone through 4 or 5 years of economic decline and stagnation. The average family's household income after tax is down 6 points lower than where it was in 2014. Our GDP per person has shrunk over the past 5 years. And you know that we have seen tens of billions of dollars of investment flee this province for other jurisdictions around the world, much of it going from our energy sector to the energy sectors in places that have lower environmental and labor standards. That's not good for us, and it's not good for the planet either. And so we are facing deep challenges. In addition to that, we're facing volatility on the global stage. What many experts projecting the possibility of a global recession. Of course, we hope that doesn't happen, but we have to prepare ourselves for what could be some challenging years ahead. This is not for the faint of heart. This is a time for real leadership, for determination, and for coordinated action. That is why our government has kept our commitment to Albertans to implement a job creation strategy to show Canada and the world that we are open for business. It's why we began with the repeal of the carbon tax, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act Bill 1. In so doing, we eliminated what I think was a dead weight cost on our economy, on households. It punished them for heating their homes and for people filling up their gas tanks to drive to work. It was a huge cost on small businesses, but also on municipalities, on school boards, on charities and nonprofits. And maybe it could have been justified if there was any demonstrable environmental benefit, but there was not. Even the government that introduced it could not make an estimate of how much it would reduce carbon emissions because the answer was close to zero. What we will do to be responsible about the environmental challenges we all face will be to introduce the Technology, Innovation and Environmental Research Fund, which will be a levy on major industrial emitters to support research and development, to develop technology that can help us reduce carbon and greenhouse gas output. This should not be a big ideological football. If we want to do right by future generations and for our planet, then we need to take real, concrete, practical measures to reduce carbon intensity in our economy. And we need to tell the story about how our huge investments in technology have already done so, how we've reduced by nearly 30% the intensity of a barrel of bitumen since the year 2000 and are on track to do it by another 20%. The TIER Fund will help to accelerate those reductions in carbon emissions without punishing ordinary people simply for living normal lives, and without burdening municipalities, school boards, and charities for simply the cost of operating. So we think it was the right thing to do. Secondly, okay, go ahead. And by the way, about 2/3 of Albertans agreed with us. Secondly, we passed Bill number 2, the Open for Business Act, which undid policies that were driving investment out of our province, brought back workplace democracy, and balanced back to our labor legislation to show that while we fully respect collective bargaining rights and our good women and men in our unions, we also need to send a message to small businesses and job creators that they will not be punished for growing, expanding, and operating in Alberta. Thirdly, we passed the job creation tax cut, which is a centerpiece of our economic growth strategy, which, as you know, reduces the general tax rate on job creators by 1/3 from 12 points to 8 points. Now, some people say, this has been characterized, I suspect it was on this stage a couple of hours ago, by one of my colleagues in the legislature. This has been characterized as a, quotes, multi-billion-dollar giveaway to profitable corporations. That is frankly completely misleading. Economist after economist after economist has said that this is the most effective way for us to attract job-creating investment in Alberta and to get the economy moving again. Professor Jack Mintz, the most highly respected tax economist in Canada, estimates that this will help to create an additional 55,000 full-time private sector jobs. Professor Bev Dalby at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy estimates that this will significantly grow Alberta's GDP, our per capita GDP, and he estimates that by the 4th year it will actually increase government revenues. Other recent academic research concludes that reducing the business tax rate has the effect of increasing wage levels and incomes for ordinary working people. So this is also a progressive growth strategy. And it should be noted that a previous Alberta government, which raised the business tax rate, saw a 4-year decline in revenues coming from Alberta businesses. By the way, that also happened when they raised income taxes. So, and we must recognize that we had an advantage which we have lost. While we were raising our rates, our major competitors in the United States were cutting their rates significantly. Business tax rates in the United States slashed by 1/3. Folks, we are competing for job-creating investment with places like Texas and Colorado, Oklahoma, and North Dakota. We've gone from having a lower and more attractive tax environment compared to those states to a significantly higher and less attractive tax environment, which is clearly one of the reasons there has been, that giant sucking sound, as Ross Perot called it, has been tens of billions of dollars of capital relocating to those jurisdictions. You may have seen the recent story about cities in Texas doing direct mail campaigns to employers in Alberta to move them down to Texas, and how apparently some 150 Calgary companies alone have done so in the past 3 years, according to the city of Lubbock, Texas. Well, folks, we can't take that line down. And let me tell you, I will be leading a trade and an investment mission to Texas in November with the message that we now have lower taxes, we have a better quality of life. Calgary that voted Mayor Nenshi the highest quality of life of any major city in North America. Edmonton, an incredible innovation and tech hub. We have lower cost for AAA office space. We have the youngest and best educated population in Canada, if not in North America. We're reducing red tape through our Red Tape Reduction Action Plan by 1/3. We'll be accelerating approvals to meet or beat any jurisdiction in the United States. I will be down there in Texas to say, Texas, it's on. Alberta will soon be the most competitive jurisdiction in North America for investment and job creation. Let me say a word about the red tape, because this has become, I think, a hidden impediment to growth and investment in our economy. I think during the good years, most of us didn't pay attention to the constant layering of regulatory complexity in our economy. And we're all responsible for it, both the provincial and local and federal governments and regulatory agencies. Collectively, we didn't see it happening. But now, when you take a step back, what do we see? According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Alberta is the most over-regulated province in Canada, the only province to get an F on their red tape report card. That is so contrary to our image of Alberta as the get-her-done entrepreneurial province that we could see on the west coast next door in British Columbia, that they get an A on the red tape report card and Alberta's been getting an F. Our approval timelines have become unacceptably long, filled with uncertainty. You know, you can get a project approved in Texas, for example, in 1/4 as much time as it takes on average here in Alberta. That's why we passed the Red Tape Reduction Act. That's why we appointed an Associate Minister for Red Tape Reduction and Grant Hunter as the most coveted job in Cabinet, I think, actually. And that is why we are doing a comprehensive review of the function of the Alberta Energy Regulator. We want to maintain its independence and its high standards as a world-class regulator, but we want the AER and other Alberta government regulatory bodies and ministries to apply a common-sense, outcome-based approach to regulation rather than a process-obsessed regulatory approach. What am I saying? If you have companies with a perfect compliance record with regulation, then common sense should tell us that they do not require the same level of oversight as companies with a very poor compliance record. That we should allow for concurrent rather than lengthy consecutive approvals. So government agencies should be working in tandem to get things done rather than stringing things out for 2 or 3 years in ways that have cost us investment and jobs. So part of the deal is this. We are bold about this 1/3 reduction. And by the way, this is not pie in the sky. British Columbia set out 15 years ago to reduce red tape by 1/3. They actually reduced 40% of the regulatory requirements imposed by their government under the Gordon Campbell Liberals, and are now one of the most highly rated jurisdictions in North America as a result. So this can be done, but we must be partners in it. And as I've said to you before, when I was opposition leader, we are very serious about cutting the red tape burden imposed by the Alberta government on our municipalities. You have to waste too many of your tax dollars, too much time of your officials, too much attention of your councils, complying with endless provincial mandates and administrative obligations and reporting requirements. As I've always said, look, you folks are accountable to your voters. You have to publish audited financial statements. And if you screw up, you hear about it when you go to the grocery store or the garage. Why do you need provincial bureaucracies peering over your shoulders on every dollar that you spend? And that's right. So, and we've already begun, as you know, to reduce the reporting requirements for some of the grants, and we're just getting started. I want to thank AUMA for your very detailed and thoughtful submissions. And let me say that we are open to not just streamlining the regulatory relationship between the Alberta government and your municipalities, but I'm very open to taking a comprehensive look at the Municipal Government Act. I know it's always been amended, but it always seems to get longer and more complicated through those amendments. One of the things that shocked me in provincial government is frankly, the arrogance of the provincial government micromanaging your affairs through the MGA. The level of detailed regulation in that. So it doesn't make sense to me. So let's be partners in lowering those barriers. And so we have fewer public servants checking and more public servants doing, less administration and more delivery. Let's be partners in that. But we offer you this streamlining on one condition, that you do everything in your power to pass on those regulatory savings to your citizens, especially your job creators, by reducing the red tape burden that is imposed on the job-creating private sector. That's what I mean by rowing in the same direction. And with respect to our efforts to reduce taxation, I know that some governments here were concerned about our amendments to the MGA to allow for longer and greater tax relief for new capital investment in municipalities. I will point out that this was in our platform that was endorsed by Albertans, and the idea came from certain municipalities. Now, I think, let me explain the rationale here. As I said, we are competing. Just yesterday, I was meeting with a group that is looking at the possibility of a $10 to $15 billion capital investment in a major job-creating project east of Edmonton. And they were very specific about the jurisdictions. There's 3 other jurisdictions that are vying for that project. All of them have lower property taxes. And at the end of the day, when that company goes to its board for a final investment decision, they have to take an all-in cost approach. That includes business taxes, it includes labor costs, it includes property taxes. And so all we did with that amendment was to give those municipalities who are hungry for that kind of investment the flexibility to compete with jurisdictions like those along the US Gulf Coast that have similar incentives. It's ultimately up to you, and you're accountable to your citizens whether you use these tools. But we saw these amendments as simply adding more tools in our toolbox for you to help us create jobs and growth. And let me say generally on taxation that we hope that again, we will row in the same direction in trying to restrain or, wherever possible, actually reduce the tax burden on the job-creating functions in our economy. I know it's easy to say and it's hard to do. Believe me, I know it's hard to do. We're challenged in our own fiscal management, which I'll discuss in a moment. But at the end of the day, we all need to work together to send a message that Alberta's governments, both provincially and locally, have a pro-growth orientation. And we encourage you at least not to have tax rates that exceed inflation, economic growth, and population growth. If we can at least manage our affairs in line with the growth of our economy and our populations, then I think we're doing our citizens justice. So, the long story short here is that we are doing everything that we can, and part of this is an aggressive posture in promoting trade and investment in Alberta. This is why last week I spent 3 days on Wall Street. I met with dozens of firms that represent collectively over $9 trillion of assets under management. And I can tell you most of those companies have been deeply invested in Alberta's economy in the past, but most of them have also diminished their presence in this province. And they sent me a very clear message that they continue to believe in Alberta, but we've got to show them, obviously, with pipelines and market access, with regulatory predictability, and with other issues, we have to show them that this province is open for business. So the potential is there, but it's not going to happen by accident. Let me then talk about the huge fiscal challenge we face. By the way, these two things are linked. I've always said that the best way we can balance the budget is to grow our economy, and with it grow revenues, correct? So, folks, this is a huge challenge, and we all have to be part of the solution. I'm sure most of you have become familiar with Dr. Janice McKinnon's panel. I want to thank her and her panelists, a remarkably qualified group of nonpartisan experts who took 3 months out of their lives to help give us an objective look at Alberta's fiscal challenges and offer a pathway forward. They highlighted that Alberta's debt has gone from $13 to over $60 billion in the last 4 years, that we have the highest per capita deficit and the fastest debt growth of any jurisdiction, subnational jurisdiction in North America, that interest costs are a growing share of the provincial budget, now $2 billion, and if we do nothing, headed to $4 billion, all of that money that could go to municipal services, roads, infrastructure, schools and hospitals, but instead is getting sucked up by bankers and bondholders as a growing share of our budget. And they underscored that Alberta, for over 20 years, has been overspending by any reasonable measurement. That if we were to be spending at the same per capita level as our three our closest peer provinces, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, in certain terms of size and scale, if we were spending at their level, we would be spending $10 billion less than we are. Instead of a $7 billion deficit, we would have a $3 billion surplus. And that's not the worst of it. They underscored with data, with hard evidence, that according to many major metrics, we are underperforming our peer provinces. We have generally longer surgical wait times. We have generally lower high school completion and post-secondary completion. We have shorter life expectancy, higher infant mortality. And in metric after metric, we underperform other provinces, even though our per capita spending is 20% higher. So to those who say that the solution is just to raise taxes, I say, why during a time of ongoing economic adversity would our first response be to dig our hands deeper into the pockets of taxpayers? How about we actually focus on operating at least as efficiently as other Canadian governments? I think Albertans expect that of us, and they have a right to that. And again, we need to be partners in this. The McKinnon panel, as you know, underscored that our per capita spending on capital investment has been higher than the Canadian provincial average for 20 years, even though the average age of infrastructure in Alberta is lower than in other provinces. In 2017, our net capital stock per capita was 19% above the 10-province average, and our municipal government's stock was 81% above the average. Capital grants to municipalities make up a quarter of all provincial spending on capital. Alberta flows roughly $440 per capita in municipal capital grants, which is 20% higher than the Canadian average. The McKinnon panel's recommendation was to reduce capital grants by $500 million a year. Now, we've not made final decisions, but none of you will be surprised if there is a reduction in the budget on capital funding. Having said that, you have made it absolutely clear that whatever happens, you want funding stability, certainty, and predictability so you can plan and budget effectively. We hear you. As Minister Madhu emphasized in his remarks yesterday, we're cutting, I've emphasized, we're cutting many of the administrative burdens that we impose upon you. We've already started with the MSI operating program, which we've streamlined to cut down on paperwork. So we are committed to the goal of predictable, reliable funding, but we all need to be part of this together. Now let me say another word about the fiscal challenge that we are facing. I was at an AUMA conference in 1993 when then Municipal Affairs Minister Steve West stood up and announced that there would be a 25% cut in provincial operating grants to municipalities. That will not be the scale of this budget, or frankly anything close to it. This does not have to be 1993, when there were 18% absolute cuts across the government of Alberta, including a 5% wage rollback across the public sector. This does not have to be 1993. It will not be like 1993. The spending restraint that we must deliver to get back to balance in 4 years and prevent a huge debt problem in this province will be thoughtful, prudent, focused, and limited. There will be, obviously, stakeholders, including perhaps some of you, who don't agree with all of the decisions that we make. And we'll listen to you. And we're trying to take on board your input right now. But please understand, folks, please understand that we cannot continue to kick this problem down the road. That we cannot live forever off of our credit card. We cannot spend money that we do not have. We cannot endlessly burden future generations to pay back plus interest with their taxes for what we consume and spend today. Of course, we want to maintain high-quality public services, and we'll be protecting the most high priority and essential services such as health and education. But we truly believe as a government, by the way, for those who say we should raise taxes, I'd like to point out that in the recent provincial election, there was only one political party that proposed higher taxes, God bless them, the Alberta Liberals, and they got less than 1% of the vote. So there is no democratic, you know why? Because Albertans are ahead of us politicians when it comes to this. And I can tell you, I've seen that on Main Street and in every corner of this province for the past 3 years. We also see it in our public opinion polling. Albertans get it. They understand you can't spend money you don't have. You can't live endlessly off your credit card. You don't want to jeopardize the long-term future of essential public services with billions of dollars of debt payments, and that we have to deal with this. And if we deal with it prudently now, it means we don't have to face a 1993 fiscal scenario 5 or 6 years down the road. So we hope that you will be with us together as Team Alberta as we make some challenging decisions to right the ship, to get our fiscal house in order, so that we have reliable funding for key public services in the future. Now, I know there's been a number of issues about some of your key priorities discussed by our ministers over the past couple of days, including law enforcement and cannabis and other issues. So I'm not going to get into that. I want to just cut to the last key point, which is how we must be Team Alberta. Thank you, by the way, for your fashion sense. I love these T-shirts. Thank you, Barry, for this latest item in my wardrobe. Folks, we're not going to get this economy back on track. You're not going to have the revenue flow to support the public services that your citizens want, nor will we, unless we break the landlock on this province. And that's not going to happen by accident. It didn't get imposed on us by coincidence or by accident. Now, some of you have heard me say this before. I'm going to say it again. The landlocking of Alberta Energy, which has helped to drive the economic crisis in this province in recent years, was the result of a deliberate, sophisticated, integrated, and largely foreign-funded campaign specifically to landlock Alberta's energy. You know, and I want to thank Mayor Franks for bringing to Sherwood Park Vivian Krause, who's done tremendous heroic research to throw a spotlight on the tens of millions of dollars that has come through something called the Tar Sands campaign, which began at a meeting of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in New York City 11 years ago, at which some 24 interest groups developed a sophisticated plan. All of the documents are now in the public domain. This is not some kind of theory, this is reality. And they determined that they were going to use every legal and political tool available to them to landlock the oil sands in particular, but the effect is Alberta and Canadian energy from global markets. I always, and you know the sophistication of that campaign. Please look at the problem is that we have tended to look at these issues in isolation, tactically, rather than looking at it, the big picture, strategically. But just follow all of the indications here. The endless legal harassment of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was executed by groups funded by organizations like the Tides Fund and Environmental Defense and these other US-funded organizations. Many of the same organizations that have been in court causing delay after delay on Keystone XL. The same organizations who lobbied successfully for the federal government to veto the approved Northern Gateway pipeline. The same organizations who ended up with senior staff in the current federal government who imposed ridiculous new regulatory requirements on TransCanada Energy's proposed Energy East pipeline that caused them to pull the plug after spending $1 billion on that, and with it killing the dream of energy independence in Canada. These are the same groups that informed the federal government's adoption of the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69, which according to the Energy Pipeline Association will make the proposal of any major pipelines in the future effectively impossible. These are the same groups that effectively lobbied for and secured the Bill C-48 tanker ban on the North Coast, which is, I think, without precedent in Canadian economic history, a prejudicial attack on only one product that comes from only one province, Alberta bitumen. And these are the same groups that continue to fund a very small number of First Nations to challenge pipelines and other projects in court while ignoring the vast majority of Western Canadian First Nations who want to be partners in prosperity through responsible resource development. And so we need to see how these things have been coordinated, and we need to respond in kind. That is why our government was elected with a mandate to fight back, to stand up. Because I always ask, why did these groups target Alberta and Canada exclusively, while the US, where most of them operate, has doubled its energy production, doubled its oil production in the past decade, including, by the way, under the Obama administration that vetoed Keystone XL while it oversaw the shale revolution that doubled US oil production. Global production of hydrocarbon energy has increased by 10 million barrels per day from the United States and OPEC countries and Russia, while this campaign was led against Canada. Why in the world would they focus on the country with the highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards amongst the major energy resources in the world? Why? Why not Saudi? Why not Venezuela? Why not Putin's Russia? Why not the OPEC dictatorships? I think the answer is because we are Canadian. We're too nice. They thought they could push us around. These are bullies picking on what they thought was the weakest kid in the playground. They didn't think we would push back. Well, we Canadians are nice. And one of the ways we demonstrate that niceness, that sense of responsibility, is by our massive investments in technology to reduce carbon intensity. And now, a barrel of Alberta heavy crude has a lower carbon footprint than the average barrel around the world. As I said, we've reduced emissions by 30% in bitumen. We're on track to reduce it by another 20%. Suncor's $1.5 billion new gas cogen facility in Wood Buffalo is an example of this. It will reduce their carbon output by 25%, reduce water usage, improve air quality, and, by the way, provide a market for stranded Alberta natural gas while producing a better return for their shareholders. We are on the cusp of a game-changing application of technology replacing water-based extraction for bitumen with solvents that will radically reduce energy consumption and water utilization. All of this will be supported by our tier fund and a levy on major emitters. So people out there, they talk about ESG, environmental and social governance, the new metric for ethical investment. HSBC and other companies have said they pulled out of the Alberta market, while they continue to finance oil and gas development in places like Saudi Arabia and Russia. And so, folks, yes, we will be fighting back. We will be challenging them to look at the entire environmental record based on real and current data, and yes, also to measure Canada's social metrics against any other major energy producer in the world, because when you look at that objectively, based on the data, how we respect human rights, labor rights, women's rights, Indigenous rights, when you look at Canada as an example of social progress and economic mobility in the world, and Alberta within Canada as the greatest engine of social mobility, as the greatest employer of Indigenous people. When you look at this province objectively, compared to any other major energy producer, we knock the lights out. We must be proud of and stand up for our record as a major energy producer. That's why things like these t-shirts actually matter. You know, it actually matters that we're leaders like you are willing, and we all need, and I want to thank you collectively for many of you going down to FCM and carrying this story. You know, we saw the Whistler Council pass a resolution to sue our energy producers. Last I checked, everybody that goes to ski in Whistler has to fly into Vancouver and take a car up the highway. Last I checked, they're heating their hotels with natural gas. Last I checked, you know, but it matters that we push back. That council apologized to Alberta. They said they got it wrong. When Toronto was trying to pass a similar motion, Councillor Mike Layton, I called John Tory, the mayor, who's a friend of mine, and called other councillors, and they pushed that motion off the agenda. We need you to help us to be out there as part of Team Alberta, communicating with your municipal colleagues across the country about how this province has been a critical engine for Canada's economy in ways from which they all benefit. You know this, and this is why we will be launching shortly what we called our Energy War Room, which will be a clearinghouse for information on our record as a responsible energy producer that will respond in real time to all of the lies and myths told about Alberta through paid, earned, and social media. We will be setting up satellite offices in key markets around the world to tell that story to investors, to opinion leaders, to political leaders. We are challenging many of these laws that are landlocking our energy. We've launched a constitutional challenge of the No More Pipelines law. We have launched the Indigenous Legal Defense Fund to support pro-development First Nations in defending their right to be consulted by the Crown before the federal government shuts down projects from which First Nations can benefit. Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Wilson, will shortly be introducing in the legislature an act to create the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which will be backstopped by $1 billion of the faith and credit of the Alberta Crown to support Aboriginal co-ownership and financial participation in major resource development, because that is a moral obligation to help our First Nations benefit from the resources that lie below the ground that their ancestors inhabited thousands of years ago. And we will be doing so much more, but we need you to be part of this team. And let me close by saying that we've been through some challenging times, but we Albertans are resilient, we are innovative, we are sometimes audacious. You know, we have always overcome adversity in our history. A lot of our fellow Albertans are still hurting. We need to send them a sign of hope, that all of us together, as the leaders of this province, are committed to doing everything we can to get this economy back on track, and of course, in so doing, to deliver the critical public services that makes this province a beacon in Canada. So folks, let's together get this done. It's not just the fight for Alberta. Because we have been played such a central role in Canadian prosperity in recent decades, it's also for our country. And I believe that if we can share our responsibly produced energy with the rest of the world to displace and compete with dictator oil, it's also good for global stability, for global human rights. So friends, together, let us stand up and fight for this province that's been good to us. Let's be good in return to Alberta so that it will continue to be a shining hope for generations to come. Thank you very much.
So Premier Kenney, thank you very much. We clearly heard you say that you need